Hey guys! I don't know about you, but I think I'm at the point now where I've gotten the hang of most of Mario Kart World's new mechanics. Charge jumping, wall riding, and rail grinding are all aspects of the game that I now fully understand and can naturally implement into my races without really having to think about it. However, Mario Kart World features one more major gameplay tweak that perhaps hasn't gotten the same amount of attention as these other new tricks, and which I've had a lot more trouble adapting to. Between the bumpy confusion of the first half of Wario Shipyard to the chaotic slippery turns of the river section of Cheep Cheep Falls, I don't really know how to feel about Mario Kart World's water driving mechanic. Sure, jet skiing across the ocean in free roam is quite fun, and also probably when the game displays its most stunning visuals, but during actual races, well, your mileage may vary, but I don't particularly like these sections. Of course, the weird thing about Mario Kart World's water driving is that it completely replaces the previous few games' underwater driving. And although this isn't the first time a core mechanic has been omitted from a Mario Kart sequel, it does feel like a bit of an odd, unexplained decision on the part of the developers. Like, during this Ask the Developers article, they basically dodged the question of why the change was made, instead only explaining decisions that were made as a result of this, as if the change itself was inevitable. So let's try to figure it out for ourselves. We'll look at how the water mechanics in previous Mario Kart games were implemented both visually and from a gameplay perspective, and compare that to this new implementation, all in an effort to answer the question of why underwater driving was removed from Mario Kart World. Now, I know this mechanic was first introduced in Mario Kart 7, but I'll be focusing on its implementation in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, since I have experience with modding that game, and it's also more comparable to Mario Kart World in terms of rendering options and overall graphical fidelity. Okay, an important thing I should establish right away is that just because Mario Kart 8 Deluxe features some playable underwater sections doesn't mean this applies to all water throughout the game. There are plenty of tracks that revolve around scuba driving as a main mechanic, and also some where underwater sections make up a small part of an otherwise normal track, but many courses also exclusively feature old-fashioned out-of-bounds water. The difference between these types is usually pretty easy to spot, since drivable water is normally see-through and out-of-bounds water is almost always opaque. For the most part, these two types utilize similar rendering techniques to create a pretty realistic water material. Because the game's water is completely flat, a normal map with a wavy animation is used to make the material react to the game's lighting as if it has depth, and an animated specular map is used to add some highlights and reflections. To render these reflections, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe makes use of cube maps. This means that for each separate lighting area in a track, the developers designated a single point from which a 360 view of the surrounding environment is rendered and projected onto all shiny materials within that area. Although this is hardly noticeable for most water in the game, the fact that only a handful of cube maps are used for each track means most reflections don't tend to line up with the placement of the reflective object. Anyways, for the normal opaque out-of-bounds water, that's basically it. These animated texture effects are displayed over top of a normal water texture or a material color. However, the translucent water is usually a lot more fancy. A cool effect that really sells this water type, I think, is that the wavy animation is also applied to the environment that can be seen below the surface of the water. Also, you know how the faces of 3D models are usually one-sided, meaning they disappear if you look at them from behind? Well, see-through water in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe actually takes advantage of this 3D modeling quirk to make it to where, if you're looking up from below the surface of the water yourself, the normal water face is no longer rendered, and instead you're looking up through a completely different mesh that displays a special underwater surface material. Some underwater sections are also spammed with these fish particle clouds that help add some atmosphere to the otherwise often empty oceans. In parts where you can drive directly in and out of water, most tracks feature this edge of the water ripples effect, which uses vertex colors to fade out on one side. The game also mimics the caustics effect, which in real life is the result of light getting filtered through the pattern of the water above, through these simple animated shapes that are automatically projected onto underwater surfaces. And the reason everything that's below the water looks appropriately blue is because the game uses one of those lighting areas I mentioned earlier to basically apply a bunch of blue fog to these parts. Though actually this nice light blue sand gradient you can see on tracks like DS Cheap Cheap Beach is just a texture. Alright, so that's all well and good, but I do think there are some problems with the visuals of Mario Kart 8 Deluxe's water. Most tracks that revolve around major submerged sections also feature a large decorative body of opaque water around the track. And once you notice it, having these two types of water side by side can feel a bit strange. Like, I'm not asking for Mario Kart to be realistic, but in real life the opacity of water isn't arbitrary, so only ever having the underwater driving segments be translucent slightly breaks the fourth wall to me. This dichotomy even influenced the design of some tracks, I think. For example, Dolphin Shoals, which has the file name GU Ocean by the way, never actually lets you drive in the ocean. Most of the track takes place in this slightly strange coral reef ravine type thing, likely because otherwise the developers would have had to model the entire ocean floor. Though actually some tracks like Animal Crossing do let you have a peek below the sea, and once you look past these repetitive coral chunks, there's nothing there. These tracks do handle the divide between normal and see-through water a bit better though, because here the water becomes more opaque the deeper the seabed goes, which is realistic. Another issue that Mario Kart 8 Deluxe's water doesn't entirely avoid is obvious texture tiling. The human brain is incredibly good at spotting repetitive patterns. I think it's a survival technique or something. But this also means that it's very hard for us to ignore the obvious limitations that come with covering a large surface using a small repeating pattern. This is something that plagues a lot of video games, and I actually wouldn't say it's that bad in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, but it does become pretty obvious the longer you stare out at the ocean. And lastly, no matter how amazing you make your water material, and even if the developers had avoided texture tiling somehow, at the end of the day, all of the water in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is still completely flat. Okay, you might say, what about the waterfalls or the rivers or this whirlpool or whatever? Sure, but you get what I mean. This isn't a big deal for tracks where somewhat flat water actually makes sense, but every ocean throughout the game being as flat as a field is a bit odd. Actually, this was even more of a problem for this custom track I made than any of the game's original tracks, since having this completely tranquil water in a track that takes place in the middle of a storm is a frustrating but inevitable visual blemish that I don't think I could have done anything to fix. Either way, all these concessions make complete sense when you consider that this is an 11-year-old Wii U game we're talking about, but how does Mario Kart World make use of the Switch 2's increased power to smooth over these problems? Well, obviously the big thing is that water is no longer completely flat in Mario Kart World. The game not only features a consistent barrage of relatively realistic ocean waves, but some enemies and objects can also dynamically interact with the shape of the water. This both plays into the gameplay mechanics associated with Mario Kart World's water, and also prevents it from feeling like a flat, unchanging pancake the way some of Mario Kart 8's water does. Areas like the sea around Peach Beach are still mostly flat, but even here, the presence of the tides is implied with these shiny splashes that are visible on the rocks along the coastline. But anyways, you may be wondering, how do these dynamic waves work? What kind of underlying system determines their shape, etc.? Sadly, that's something that I can't answer with any kind of certainty for now, because, of course, we don't have access to Mario Kart World's internals yet. What I can tell you though, is that, as far as I can tell, these waves aren't repetitive in the slightest, which contributes to the fact that the texture tiling problem is mostly gone in Mario Kart World. Some of the big patches of white foamy water still look repetitive, and in general Mario Kart World features loads of obvious texture tiling throughout the game's environment, but the ocean specifically looks completely natural now. And apart from these foamy parts, Mario Kart World's water doesn't seem to rely on simple textures or handmade models at all, but instead is made up of flexible systems that adapt to the world around them. So these cartoony white edge effects that make up the shoreline and form around larger objects within the water aren't pre-placed meshes like in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, these seem to form completely automatically. The same also goes for these white patterns around the tops of waves, though weirdly the white water edges are handled a bit more crudely for smaller assets like the player, since here the game seems to just turn the part of the model that touches the water white, instead of rendering any proper animated ripples. Regardless, I like how despite basically every body of water in Mario Kart World being interconnected, the color of said water isn't uniform whatsoever, and instead matches the environment it is a part of. Also, despite your inability to drive underwater, the game still does a better job of visualizing the opacity of water than Mario Kart 8 Deluxe did. So, in real life, unless it's particularly muddy, all water is translucent by default. The only reason you usually can't see stuff through it that's more than a few meters below the surface is because light has a hard time traveling that far down and back without getting caught up in the water's murkiness on its way. And Mario Kart World displays this effect fairly accurately, since not only can you still see submerged sand around the shorelines, but every object that dips into the water is still visible up until a certain depth. This means that for every piece of course environment that dips into water throughout the world, the developers had to make sure the models extended down far enough to where the cutoff point isn't visible. Not to mention making the game render the layer of fog that's required to recreate this effect at all times, which is a lot of work to go through for such a tiny detail. And in fact, this was touched on in that Ask the Developer interview, where programming director Kento Sato said the designers needed to toil away to make the shore floor visible, but I think it really paid off. Speaking of unnecessary details, the game also still features the same caustics effect and light blue sand gradients as Mario Kart 8 Deluxe's shorelines, despite the lack of underwater gameplay. There are also small decorative fishes you can find, and Mario Kart World's dynamic waves make it to where the shoreline itself now even has a somewhat realistic wavy animation. Another aspect of water where Mario Kart World goes above and beyond compared to 8 Deluxe is reflections. Since my knowledge of video game graphics doesn't extend far beyond Nintendo games, I'm not super up to date when it comes to modern reflection techniques, but apparently Mario Kart World uses a form of planar reflections. Although this makes for a much more detailed and accurate effect than Mario Kart 8 Deluxe's cube map reflections, this is still not super advanced compared to ray-traced alternatives, for example. So not only does the game only display reflections for background environments up until a certain distance, but these reflections also only seem to be roughly 360p, and the player and other dynamic objects aren't reflected whatsoever. Honestly, I can nitpick all sorts of stuff about Mario Kart World's water. If you angle your camera down into it, the water seems to distort to prevent the camera from clipping through it, the waves are super low detail and don't crash, and that distortion effect Mario Kart 8 Deluxe applies to the environment that's visible through water is missing in Mario Kart World. But still, in the moment, and especially whilst you're fighting for your life during one of the game's frantic races, this kind of stuff is hardly noticeable. And I genuinely think that, apart from character models and animations, this is the aspect of Mario Kart World's visuals that has improved most significantly over Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Okay, that's enough graphics rambling for one video, so now let's discuss how the gameplay of water sections changed between Mario Kart 8 Deluxe and World. Underwater sections in Mario Kart 7 and 8 Deluxe are, well, they're not that different from normal above water sections, are they? Ignoring all the aesthetic aspects, the only major gameplay change is the more floaty physics. This low gravity thing is certainly taken advantage of by a lot of tracks. Water sections often feature big jumps and sections where you have to steer whilst sinking back down, but I think it's fair to say that most underwater segments could have worked almost exactly the same without the different underwater physics. So clearly the reason this mechanic was implemented was for the mostly visual appeal of being able to design tracks that switch between land and sea. On the other hand, driving on top of water in Mario Kart World involves a number of significant gameplay tweaks. The controls are way more slippery, you can perform a trick anytime you land in the water from some height, the ocean features waves you can trick off of, which also makes drifting more difficult, and some items and enemies can also cause shockwaves you can interact with. Mario Kart World's wavy water sections are basically a more dynamic version of the wavy road sections that were especially common in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and in fact consequently there are 0 of those in World. This constant gameplay loop of tricking off of a wave, landing in the water, and tricking again, then finding another wave to trick off of, really helps with making these free roam ocean sections more than just an empty field of water. And on top of that, the large variety of obstacles and enemies you can encounter at sea means interacting with the game's water sections is never really dull, which stands in contrast to the older games. Because you were always stuck driving on the ocean floor previously, there was little to no opportunity for interaction with Cheep Cheeps or fish bones or dolphins or anything really. But Mario Kart World's water driving completely fixes that problem. Although I've mostly focused on the game's seawater so far, of course a lot of these things also apply to Mario Kart World's river sections. Driving down streams is nothing new to Mario Kart, but the World's changed water mechanics still make these sections feel more unique. I like the consistency of how, just like at sea, the white foamy bits of rivers are the parts you can trick off of. Although, am I the only one who thinks it's a bit weird that even Mario Kart World's steepest rivers aren't realistically tumultuous? These just use the normal water material, even though this stuff should be crashing down like a waterfall at this angle. Well, I think the reason for that is because making sections like these realistically white and foamy would imply you should be able to get tricks off of the entire thing, which the designers probably wanted to avoid. Though they could have at least applied the effect that's used for the river of Cheep Cheep Falls, I think. I also wanted to shed some light on the fact that, because of the game's interconnected world, the track designers must have put a lot of work into deciding which water-based track needed to go where. Like in previous Mario Kart games, sure, you can design a track to feature a bunch of waterfalls that come from nowhere and lead nowhere. But this island's semi-realism prevented Mario Kart World's developers from having that freedom. So in universe, the cloudy question mark block ruins seems to have formed this basin of rainwater, which is the source of the river that you drive through in Faraway Oasis. And Salty Salty Speedway, Cheep Cheep Falls, Dandelion Depths, Acorn Heights, and Toad's Factory all feature water sections that are a part of the same river. Though technically these are 4 separate rivers that flow from Dandelion Depths and the lake next to Drybones Burnout, and meet at a lake next to Acorn Heights instead of flowing to the sea. Which isn't logical from a hydrology perspective, but it makes sense in terms of game design because the northern shoreline of the map is out of bounds. I do like the detail that some of the rivers flow from Dandelion Depths though, because that track is right next to the map's snowy region, so that makes perfect sense. The designers didn't need to go through all this trouble. A lot of Mario games forgo this kind of subtle realism, but I think these interconnected waterways also serve a gameplay purpose, since they basically form a secondary road network with which you can explore the world. Even driving upstream is viable, since the game generously allows you to climb these steep slope sections. So I think it's evident that a lot of thought was put into everything related to water in Mario Kart World. Gosh, that was a lot of preamble to answer one simple question, but we're finally here. So with all that we've discussed, why is there no underwater driving in Mario Kart World? I think it comes down to the fact that underwater driving as a gimmick only ever worked because of the very specific scope of previous Mario Kart tracks. The unclear divide between which water is out of bounds and which water is drivable was fine in very intricately designed racetracks, but I don't see how this could have been handled gracefully in free roam mode. Making all water throughout the open world drivable would be a gargantuan task that would almost certainly result in a lot of boring empty spaces, which Mario Kart World already suffers from as it is. And if, say, to avoid this, the sea around this island was turned into traditional opaque out-of-bounds water, then how would that work with tracks like Wario Shipyard or Peach Beach? The structure of the world would have to have been completely different if keeping underwater gameplay was a priority. Maybe it wouldn't have featured an ocean at all. Or you can argue the game could have had its cake and eaten it too by including both above and underwater gameplay. However, I have a hard time imagining how that divide could have been indicated intuitively. Would you just randomly fall through the water when approaching Wario Shipyard? I don't think that could work. The inconsistent rules of underwater driving really came back to bite the developers, I think. Maybe if previous games had established some kind of underwater panel like the anti-gravity one that clearly indicates where the gimmick starts and ends, it could have been integrated into Mario Kart World. Though, speaking of which, it's not like the game features one-to-one versions of the anti-gravity or even gliders of previous games either, so clearly the developers went out of their way to separate Mario Kart World from the games that came before it, perhaps to a fault. I think it's easy to forget after the extremely iterative jump between Mario Kart 7 and 8, mechanically speaking, but the gimmicks and feel of Mario Kart games used to vary wildly with each installment. So maybe underwater driving was removed because of the flaws I've discussed throughout this video, or maybe just because Nintendo is a wacky company that never does what you expect and often prefers to innovate instead of iterate. After all, it is that mindset that likely formed the backbone for many of the big overarching changes made in Mario Kart World, whether you're a fan of them or not. I think this is why, in that interview, the developers talked about the change from below to above water driving as if they never considered anything else. And I do think that, despite my qualms with the mechanic during certain sections, overall the jet ski transformation was a good idea that works particularly well within the open world of Mario Kart World. And if you're not a fan, well, given Nintendo's fondness of cutting previously established mechanics, who knows if it will ever be in another Mario Kart game again. If you want to get conspiratorial, you could even argue Nintendo has been dropping subtle hints about this change for years now. Since Bangkok Rush features a section where you drive through water that should realistically be way less shallow than it is, and there's a scene in the Super Mario Bros. Movie where Peach drives across water using anti-gravity. What does make me question whether underwater driving is gone for good is that would pose a huge problem for retro tracks going forward. Sure, Wario Shipyard sort of works, though I definitely prefer how this part of the track played underwater, but how about Cheep Cheep Lagoon or Dolphin Shoals? I don't think those can work entirely above water, so are these off the table for future games? Well, if there's one predictable thing about Nintendo, it's their unpredictability. So honestly, I don't have any idea, and likely neither do you. Anyways, that's all I wanted to talk about for this video. I hope you enjoyed watching a guy ramble about Mario Kart Water for way too long. Big thanks to Flingus, who is a member of my public Discord server linked in the description, and who suggested this video topic as a joke. If you enjoyed this video, maybe consider leaving a like or subscribing or commenting or that kind of stuff. You can also sign up for a YouTube channel membership to get early access to my videos. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and bye bye!